Sure. Born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, which is also the home of my wife now of almost 25 years. And grew up in the church, grew up very active in the church, but I think at some point, maybe toward the end of my college career, began to really discern that it was a call to ministry that was really going to consume my life. I was tracking to end up in broadcasting and film, and that's indeed what my degree was from Boston University. But came to the realization that the broad expanse of ministry was what really would make my heart sing.
Was there anything specifically that caught you? I mean, how did it all come about? Was there a moment where you're like, hey, this is something I really want to get into and do with my life?
You know, I don't know if there was a specific moment as much as just an ongoing kind of continuation of that pressing on my heart and my spirit. I had some wonderful mentors in ministry. The pastor of my church in Cleveland was somebody who I looked up to, and his leadership model was really, I think, in so many ways ahead of its time. But I think it gave me a sense of what it meant to really be engaged in ministry, yes, in the pulpit and in the congregational context, but even more broadly as well. So I think those influences, that kind of influence, was what really continued to push me toward the direction of where I am now.
All right, so moving into the subject at hand here, why do you think the Christian church should pay attention to teen and unplanned pregnancy?
At any point when there is an unplanned pregnancy, a teen pregnancy or unplanned pregnancy, especially in the context of a church community or a community of faith, it affects not only those individuals for whom the pregnancy is occurring, the mother and indeed the father as well, but more often than not, it affects a larger community as well, and people who need support and encouragement to walk through that particular season of life, if you will. So it's an understood thing to me that the church should be concerned about those things that have an impact upon not just people who are already part of church communities, but people who need that support and that encouragement. And especially if you're talking about a teenage pregnancy, you're talking about a young person or young persons who need the support, the encouragement, and the guidance that oftentimes comes from a community of faith.
Well, I mean, we obviously have some issues. Why do you think the church is ignoring these issues, and why do you think they're not addressing the issues? What makes it an uncomfortable subject?
Well, I think the church is ignoring or not addressing this, maybe in some respects because the thinking is that there's not the capacity to address it effectively or meaningfully, and maybe kind of dismantling the cultural context of shame and marginalization of somebody who finds himself in this kind of a situation. I think it's important for the church to realize a couple of things. First of all, that being relevant in the lives of individuals, be it young people, teenagers who end up pregnant, or even anyone with an unplanned pregnancy, it's important for the church to have an understanding of how to engage in that circumstance and having a healthy attitude about speaking into that circumstance in a person's life, just like you'd be speaking into a person's life no matter what a circumstance was, whatever issues arose, whatever challenges arose. And I think the church has to do a better and stronger job of equipping itself for being able to address this kind of issue.
Okay. So what is the experience of young teenage girls and boys in churches that ignore these topics? How do you think they feel?
Well, I think, interestingly enough, it's been my experience that a lot of times teenagers who don't feel like they're being listened to, they feel like they're being ignored, will find another conduit. They'll find another outlet, or they'll just sort of wall off that aspect or that portion of their lives, which is a tragedy because, again, where the support needs to come from and the encouragement needs to come from is within that church community. And I think there needs to be the ability to have dialogue and support without judgment. And that's a tough one for, I think, a lot of people in the church, because even though we would all like to say, well, I'm not judgmental, there's a lot of times parts of our institutional culture that certainly comes across that way. So I think doing the hard work of speaking into the lives of certainly teenagers who find themselves in this situation without the tint of being judgmental is so critical. Because otherwise, they're not going to listen to you, and you're not going to have the opportunity to have influence at all.
So speaking to the judgment part of it, what do you feel the church can do to alleviate some of that, so that, you know, kids feel comfortable coming to the church and coming to the leaders in the church and saying, hey, I'm in a situation that might not be ideal. You know, obviously there just needs to be that trust. What can the church do to gain that trust with the teens?
Well, I think human sexuality is something, first of all, it's interesting to note that the Bible doesn't shirk away from the topic of human sexuality. In fact, there are whole books in the Bible that really speak to that issue, Song of Solomon and many places in other books as well. So I think having a realization that addressing human sexuality is real, and making sure that young people understand that there will be supportive and helpful and beneficial talk and conversation that comes from their church, their faith community. And that does take preparation and training. I think there are great resources that are already out there, and some that are taking shape to equip church leaders and people who are just part of a faith community to be able to have these frank conversations around these issues. It's tough, yeah, it's not comfortable, but it's essential.
What program do you think is needed to address teen and unplanned pregnancy?
I think several prongs need to be a part of any kind of program. I think to talk about the realities of health, to talk about the whole dimension around reproductive health is critical and important. I think along with that, to have at hand information, if you will, data about the realities of unplanned pregnancy and teenage pregnancy. In other words, what the outcomes of that can potentially be, and whether a pregnancy is carried to term or whatever might be the circumstance, for people to have a clear understanding of what this all entails. So I think that there really needs to be an understanding of the realities, again, of human sexuality and how that's a part of the scope of everyone's life, but then also to talk about the impact of these, and ultimately it boils down to choices and equipping young people with the tools to make the right choices. We can't make those choices for them, but we can certainly equip them to make choices that are grounded on solid decision-making ability and solid underpinnings. Well, I've been a pastor of congregations for over 25 years, so yes, on a number of occasions I've encountered people who have found themselves in a circumstance, and it varies. I think for some it's been a situation of real crisis and helping them to walk through the challenges of something that, again, they didn't plan for or expect, and trying to figure out what the ramifications are going forward. And for others, I think, again, helping them, being part of the, I guess you could say, the chorus of support that oftentimes comes around this kind of situation. I think that's probably most important, to make sure that anybody in a circumstance like this, first of all, knows that they're being supported and underpinned by your, again, support and encouragement. I think the most destructive thing, and unfortunately, as I said earlier, it's been part of kind of institutionally, I think, of so much of maybe some of the history of what we've done. And there he goes again. Sorry.
No, we'll just cut it.
Okay.
Just pick up where you were.
All right.
And then
Sure.
we'll
Yeah.
just cut it.
Isn't that amazing? Though? I thought nice seeing that. But you know, wait a minute. If he's
He knows we're doing something.
yeah, right. I was going to say if he's near the door, I was going to swing the door. But anyway, okay, we'll see what we can do.
Let's tuck your mic back in.
Sorry.
The cord.
Oh, yeah.
Flip it under there. Cool.
Okay, tell me where you want me to pick back up.
Just go.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I think the most important thing to do for anybody who finds himself in that situation, a young woman who's pregnant, or a young man who finds himself to be the father in an unexpected pregnancy, is, again, the support, the wisdom, the encouragement, and I guess also, you know, some truth talking in a supportive and encouraging way. In the church that I served in Washington for 17 years, I always made it a point when we had baby dedications for young couples. Oftentimes, even if they were not married, we would still have the baby blessing, because I thought it was a critical and an important message to send to the congregation. But oftentimes, I'd make it a point to take the couple to the side and very lovingly give them the encouragement that they needed to know what kind of commitment they needed to make to this young child coming into the world. And I think that kind of support needs to, again, be a regularly understood and expected thing coming from the church.
So, as you know, a lot of the responsibility ends up being placed on the young lady in this situation. So, tell me, why do you think we need to reach out to young men and tell them where they are in their role in this? And, you know, why is it important to reach out to the young men?
Wow, I think I'm glad that there are more and more programs and initiatives, not enough yet, but more programs that I think are taking shape to speak to the issue of responsibility across the spectrum, both for young women and young men. I think it is important for a young man to understand that producing a child does not equate to fatherhood. That fatherhood is the encompassing love, care, and presence that you give to that child that you have helped to conceive. But I also think, again, it's important to equip young people with an awareness and an understanding of what responsibility looks like. And I do know that there's a wide spectrum of thought about how that all unfolds, but I think it's important and critical for young people to be equipped with facts and equipped with an understanding of what it means to make responsible adult choices if they're going to engage in adult behavior.
If a congregation was to take one step to start working on these issues, what would they do? What should they do?
I think there are a number of ways to go about this. I think on one end of the spectrum, having the information and having the resources so that young people can become equipped with a fuller understanding of all the things that are in the mix, if you will, once they are at a point in their lives when they can conceive children. And that not only applies to young teenagers, but certainly to anybody, you know, by way of when you talk about unplanned pregnancy. And then I think on the other end of the spectrum, that a church needs to always signal its sense of embrace and support and encouragement for people, no matter where they are on their life's journey. And if part of that life's journey includes an unplanned or teen pregnancy, again, the worst thing for a faith community, the worst thing for the church to do is to turn a shoulder, to shun, to reject, to marginalize, because then the very opposite effect of the kind of love and support that we ought to be always a part of or always about is what takes place.
Do you think the Bible speaks to these issues? Is there a theological perspective on teen and unplanned pregnancy?
Well, if we look at where Joseph found himself at the time of prior to Jesus' birth, Joseph thought that he was dealing with a teenage unplanned pregnancy. Joseph didn't understand or comprehend what had occurred in Mary's life. And so he initially had a response, as we read in the text, that was very human. The text talks about him wanting to quietly put her away. But then I guess he came to a realization, and obviously as the story unfolds, we know how it unfolds. It became evident to Joseph that what was the most reflective of a loving God was to obviously lovingly embrace not only Mary, but obviously the child that Mary bore. And while that's an incredibly and fully unique situation, none of us will ever find ourselves in the circumstance that Mary and Joseph found themselves in. But I still think it's a model. I think it's a model for helping us to understand that, yes, we have to work through sometimes some very human feelings and emotions around the challenges and the stresses of this kind of a situation, but ultimately we're called to embrace, to love, and to nurture and to encourage. I think that's the consistent pattern, I think, if you look throughout the text, both in the Hebrew Scriptures and in the New Testament as well.
So what's the cost, practical, moral, or moral, if the church fails to engage?
Well, I think the cost is multifaceted. I think the fact that we know the statistics of teenage pregnancy in terms of what happens when the children of unplanned and oftentimes, I should say, unplanned and teenage pregnancies, we know the challenges that are inherent oftentimes in those circumstances. And the fact that those are children who find themselves oftentimes socioeconomically at a disadvantage. I think that's one thing, for example, that the church needs to come to grips with, is that we can have a direct impact in that regard, because the support and nurture that we give in those circumstances can help, I think, to lessen that impact. I think also the fact that when we talk about really understanding where we are in 21st century America, the church, in order to be relevant, needs to at least be equipped to address these issues. And I'll be respectful of the wide theological spectrum that people bring to this conversation, but even so, there still has to be a strategy and a language that confronts the realities of where young people find themselves in this day and age, and how the church is going to be able to come alongside them. So I think understanding the language that's critical, understanding the tools that are necessary, that's part of the strategy. And I think if we don't do that, we don't do it at our own peril, because I think we'll alienate further a generation of young people, and I think sadly add to the problem as opposed to helping to resolve it.
So as a father, how do you think other men should engage with this issue?
Well, the first and probably the most compelling thing I think that any father can do, and I certainly try to do it in my own role as the father of two young daughters, is the ministry of presence, and so oftentimes the example that is not necessarily spoken but lived out is far more enduring than whatever wise or witty things we think we might want to share with our children. So I think that's critical. That presence in the life of your children is immeasurably important. And then at the same time as well, understanding that to the best of anybody's ability, being that sounding board, letting them know that if they come to you with anything, that they're never going to have rejection. They're never going to have you push them away. Even if it's a hard thing to grapple with, you're still there to be supportive and to come alongside them in whatever aspect of their life's journey they find themselves in.
So is there anything else you'd like to add? Any way to wrap it up with a tight knot, tight bow?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that I'm happy that these kinds of conversations and the work that's going on around addressing teenage and unplanned pregnancy is happening. I think that the church, the faith communities in general, benefit when the resources are created and made available to them. I think there are a lot of churches, a lot of faith communities who want to be able to address these issues, and yet maybe have been hesitant to do so because they haven't had the tools and the ability to do it, because just not knowing even kind of where to begin. So I'm encouraged that this conversation is ongoing and happening in more places and in more circumstances, because I think that ultimately benefits the church, because it makes sure that we're relevant in the lives of young people and others, but it also benefits those young people because it means we're coming to them with, again, some support and resources that will hopefully help them through whatever stage of life they find themselves in.
We're done. That was perfect.
Great. Easy.
Yeah.
I do know that I'm saying the partnership. Yeah, that's right. It's a part. Yeah, 'cause I'm not values partnership, but this entity, they stay away from getting into the middle of the whole issue of what choices people, because they're not trying to be pro-choice or anti-choice, which is, that's a difficult place to to be. So I, because I, in the conversation, as you were asking me the questions, I think I was sort of defaulting to, and you did ask me a question that, and I'll be honest with you, I figured I didn't expand out because I presumed that it's probably not something that would be as helpful or useful in the context of this, because I've had people who've come to me who've found themselves pregnant, and we've walked through that, et cetera. And then I've actually had people who've come to me who have been grappling with the issue of terminating pregnancy. And
well, I mean, I think that's kind of important too, because that's like, obviously a big issue. Obviously, we're talking about teens and what they want to do with their bodies. So I mean, I just think, especially, I've known some women that have terminated.
Oh yeah.
And it's like,
oh, yeah.
I mean, I never pass judgment because I'm not a woman.
Right.
I can't tell you what to do, but I mean, I think it's important for people to know, that. I mean, how do you feel about it? And is it something you're against? Is it for? I mean, I don't want to get into the whole political.
Well, that's my thing, and that's the thing,
yeah.
and that's what I was trying to say, is that I know that they have tried, because that what gives them the ability to kind of even operate in this space. Because if they were, for example, if they came across as
pro
either way, that then the other half is not going to listen to them.
Right.
So I do know that that's been. But I mean, yeah, I mean, but that's the only reason I didn't sort of delve into that whole thing, because I do know that, again, like I said, when we were sitting there in D.C. around the table, I'm saying they, I can't remember who heads up. Anyway, she was making the point that, yeah, that's a challenge for them, because they've had both progressives and conservatives, who've come alongside to help in the context of the work that they're doing. But obviously, if it was a situation where the conservatives were like, oh, wait a minute, y'all are advocating, for choice, or the progressives, wait a minute, y'all are saying, no options in that regard. So it's a tough one.
So how do you, like, if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I'm pregnant, I'm thinking about terminating, what's the discussion? I mean, what is the conversation you have with them?
Well, I can tell you that the conversation I've had in the past was twofold. I said, obviously, this is a profoundly personal decision. And I guess the thing I would always say to them is, you have to judge the weight of this decision, both presently and then going forward. Now, for some people, the context is very clear to them that they're just not, the capacity to endure the pregnancy and then to have the child is just not something that they can mentally, psychologically do. And then you say to somebody, but at the same time, do you want to make sure that you're not going to beat yourself up for the next 40 years?
Yeah,
for doing that. And I think people come down on various places on the spectrum, and that's the challenge. I mean, I can't make, I'll be honest. I mean, I'm a pretty progressive clergy person, so I'm not going to be the one preaching the flaming anti-abortion sermons, because I don't, like you just said a minute ago, I can't put myself in the place of a woman. And I guess my bigger issue is, yeah, you can have that discussion in a theological context, but I'm more concerned about the fact that state legislators and Supreme Court justices think that they have the right to decide what goes on inside of a woman's womb. So, but I think the issue is, and it boils down to the person, is this going to be a situation where you wrestle? It should never be an easy choice, meaning, in other words, I don't think you should ever say, oh, well, that was easy and didn't faze me. But the question then becomes, do I know I went through a hard decision, I made the decision and I'm going to go ahead and put my life back together, or I made this decision and it's going to haunt me for, the rest of my life, which for some people, I think, depending on kind of where they are with this, it can, and I think that's the thing I would always have somebody to weigh,
So, I mean, do you ever discuss like other options, like abortion? I mean, not abortion.
Adoption.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, and I've actually, interestingly enough, have had people who've made that choice as well. However, I will say that also you have to, again, you have to wrestle with the fact that the choice is a difficult one too, because you still got to talk about carrying a pregnancy to term. You still have to talk about how a person feels on the other side of giving birth and giving up the child. So in other words, that doesn't, to me, at least in my mind, stand as, and I'm not saying you're saying this, but I'm just saying it doesn't stand as the easy alternative.
Right.
You know?
Absolutely not.
Yeah, and I think that's what people have to understand.
Because that child also ends up growing up.
Right.
You know, and then at some point,
Right.
I'm thinking you may have an interaction with that child.
Well, you know, in this day, think about it. You know, years ago, when a child was adopted and they had the quote sealed records, and back when we lived in an analog world, and it was you know. But nowadays, I mean, you know, you can find out, my goodness, you know, about who you are and who you came from and all that a lot more easily. So you're right. I think you have to be realistic about that. But I think, you know, I think for the most part, interestingly enough, when I've had younger women, I never had a teenager, or I'm saying teenager like anywhere from whatever, 15 to 21 or whatever. I never really actually had any of them who sort of contemplated abortion as much as maybe an older woman who did, older as in, you know, maybe above that age, not old, but who wrestled with it. And then very often with those younger women, it was about the issue of, okay, if I'm going to have, as I have this pregnancy, you know, what unfolds, and it's tough, you know. There's a young woman at the church who had a little boy when she was in college. She took a little time, finished. She and her sister both got their master's degrees at the same time subsequent to this. I mean, just an amazing success story. And the little boy's just an amazing little kid, and she's one, you know, I mean, it's turned out as good as you could even imagine. I sat in the office with her and the baby's father, and it was interesting because he wasn't really stepping up, and she wasn't having it. She wasn't having this kind of like, you know, half-timey kind of thing. And it was impressive, but that's unfortunately not always the case. Sometimes it's...
So tell me more about that story. I mean, I think that's actually pretty interesting that somebody's actually gone through this and you had a successful outcome.
Sure.
For what it is, like somebody actually came out positive on the other side of it.
Oh yeah, well, it's interesting because she, for example, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier, the level of support, the level of encouragement. These were two sisters who grew up in the church, you know, sort of that model, always in the Sunday school program and always dressed up in the pretty little Easter dresses and everything else, off to college. Their grandmother, who actually raised them, passed away, and so they were sort of at a stretch of time, I don't want to really say on their own, but the support structure was very different than it had been. But in the context of going off to college and getting pregnant, I guess maybe sophomore year in college, I think thereabouts. Instead of, again, being met with pushing away and the shame and the marginalization, it was, okay, how do we work through this thing? How do we figure this thing out? And it was coupled with that support, and then alongside that, the intestinal fortitude that she certainly had. It was, I think part of the uniqueness is that she's a remarkable young woman. And so upon the birth of her child, two things unfolded. She was embraced, certainly by our church family, and encouraged, as was her child, little boy. And I made it a point, I think I said it earlier on, when I first got to the church, and it's nobody's fault, it's not a point of blame, you know, when a person had a child out of wedlock, we would maybe do a dedication, but it would be off kind of to the side, literally, you know, in the chapel. Also, not Sunday morning service. And I wrestled with that because I understood, at least in some respects, kind of what went into that. But I realized, no, wait a minute, you've got to make it clear to this congregation that when Jesus said, "Suffer the little children, let them come unto me, don't hinder them," he was making no qualifications, no exceptions, and so this is an opportunity to live that out. And so I think the church, you know, had a sense of innate supportiveness. I mean, how can you not love and support? You know, so I think what encouraged her was she knew she had that backstop, if you will, and coupled with the fact that, you know, we just made the same loving fuss over that little baby that we would any baby coming out of the quote most ideal of circumstances. And I think that encouraged her. I think she never, for example, there would never be a Sunday when she wasn't excited about coming to church with her little boy, and knowing that he was going to be loved and embraced, et cetera. And that can't do anything but encourage somebody, you know. And I think so. And then obviously she was able to have the support structure, not easy, but she was able to have the support structure to go back to school, finish up her remaining semesters. And then by the time that had happened and got situated and was working, and then was able to go on and do graduate study even while being a single mother. And to this day, every time I see her on Facebook, it just reminds me of what support and encouragement can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, it's definitely good to hear that, because we're talking about it just from the standpoint of this is happening. But now, we know this is actually prevalent, especially amongst the Black community.
Yeah.
But seeing a story of perseverance and the testimony of somebody actually coming positive on the other side of it, I think is really important.
Yeah.
Not to say, hey, do this,
but that's
you'll be fine. But
the reality is, and I guess you come to a point of understanding. Well, you know what? Yeah, we can all say, well, here's the ideal way to live your life, or here's the ideal sort of mode of tracking through. But guess what? Stuff happens. Yeah. and the reality is, yeah, we can all figure out what we can do in a perfect scenario. But it's when those unexpected things happen, that's when we're really called to dig deep. I mean, that's in those unexpected moments, that's when our faith and our bearing witness of our faith, that's when it really matters. And so I think that, yeah, we want to say to all of our kids, okay, here, make all the right choices, and don't ever let anything happen that would sort of rock that boat, if you will. But the reality, and you and I know, is very different, and that there are going to be things that unfold, and maybe they won't be quite as all-encompassing or as dramatic as an unexpected pregnancy. But whatever they are, the support's got to be there. And so when that arises, what's the value at that point? And that's why I can't quite get with even just from a logical sequence, to sort of try to turn the clock back and say, okay, now we got to shame you. Now we got to marginalize you. Now we got to disenfranchise you because you made a mistake. Well, the mistake has been made. Now, what's the next step? There's a great gospel artist, Donnie McClurkin. One of my favorite songs of his. We fall down, but we get up. And I think that's the message that the church community, the faith community, that's the message of real grace and redemptive love. That okay. Not perfect, guess what? Join the club. Because that's the club that we all have automatic lifetime membership to, the club of imperfections. So therefore, in light of that, let's figure out how we can step forward from this circumstance. And that's, I realize, I don't want to sound naive in thinking that it's easy for an individual or even a church to sort of do that, because I guess you want to have ideals or mores that you want to hold up to, but again, the reality being that when we don't hit that mark, when we miss that mark, that's when we've really got to be supportive. And I think, yeah, had we not, for example, in the instance that I shared, had we not shown that love and support, she probably would have, I don't know, kind of retreated to another sort of space and place, if you will. Probably not a church, probably not a faith community. Would have just gone on and kind of tried to eke out her existence. But here's a mother and a son. She's got a graduate degree. She's tracking wonderfully well professionally. He's going to be the beneficiary of all of that. And that's the outcome of, again, the network of support that she had.